Greetings from Cambridgeshire. Perhaps the first reference to Singapore in world history was made in the 2nd century CE in a work called Geographica by the Greek-speaking scientist Claudius Ptolemy, living in Alexandria, Egypt, when it was part of the Roman Empire. He was a mathematician, astronomer, and music theorist, as well as a geographer. And drawing on the astonishing wealth of knowledge in the great library of Alexandria, reports of travellers, previous maps, and astronomical deductions, he created a world map described in his text called the Geographica. And a place called Sabana or Sabara, a trading post, was marked on the 11th map of Asia at the southern tip of the Golden Chersonese, meaning the Malay Peninsula. The scientific brilliance of the ancient Greeks is exemplified by Ptolemy's work on cartography and geography. There's scarcely a scientific discipline which wasn't invented and or greatly advanced by ancient Greek thinkers. You can't study politics at university without reading Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics. You can't write a history of democracy without Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War and the Constitution of Athens by one of Aristotle's students. Physics was invented by ancient Greek scientists, as were rational medicine by Hippocrates and numerous technological inventions, such as the screw pump that could move water uphill by Archimedes. And the Greeks' intellectual creativity is why so many academic disciplines have the suffix ology attached to them, the ancient Greek word for talk or discourse. Biology, the study of life. Zoology, the study of animals, all living things. And the great branches of philosophy or love of wisdom are these: epistemology, study of knowledge; ontology, studying of being or existence; ethics, now no ology suffix there, just how should we behave. And branches of medicine have Greek names too: gynecology, for women's medicine; pharmacology, study of drugs; oncology, specialism in cancer; cardiology, endocrinology. Others end in iatry or iatrics, medical topics; paediatrics, podiatry, psychiatry. And the Greeks invented the majority of recognised genres of literature: history writing, historiography, geography, biography, recording of people's lives, speech making, rhetoric, lyric solo love poems, Sappho, and of course all the subgenres of drama, tragedy, comedy, and later ballet dancing, which they called pantomime. They also created staggering architecture and art that have never ceased to inspire imitation and are familiar across the entire planet, for example at Singapore City Hall. It was designed and built by the architects of the Singapore Municipal Commission, A. Gordons and F.D. Meadows, between 1926 and 1929, and a very imposing flight of stairs takes visitors from the Corinthian colonnade to the main building. But let me move forward nearly 2,000 years from the ancient Greeks and 3 decades from City Hall to this beautiful self-portrait by Li Man Fong, painted in 1958. Li was brought as a child to Singapore by his father, a Chinese merchant from Hangzhou in China. And his artistic talent was spotted soon, and he worked hard to make money doing advertisements and other commissioned artwork. But he immersed himself in the art history of the world, and this cosmopolitanism is reflected in all his paintings. And this self-portrait shows him surrounded by his professional tools, the palette and the easel. The chrysanthemums pay tribute to a common motif in Chinese art, and he wears the light clothing suitable to the local climate. But he's also surrounded by several plaster casts of famous ancient Greek statues, especially reminiscent of the pedimental sculptures from the Athenian Parthenon temple. The self-portrait seems to me to express a very specific Singaporean cultural identity, neither denying nor glorifying the component that's associated with Western colonial culture, European aesthetics. It's just simply there, a fact of Singaporean life, and contains no specific political or ideological message. It's also beautiful. My third exhibit is the so-called Singapore Stone, displayed at the National Museum of Singapore. The stone is a fragment of a bigger slab, once welcoming visitors at the mouth of the Singapore River. The British blew it up in 1843, I'm sorry, to build a fort, but this bit survived, and the sandstone slab was once part of a monument, and it had an ancient epigraph measuring at least 9 metres, carrying about 50 lines of text. And the writing system is quite unique, never found anywhere else and never used in any other text. And it remains undeciphered. This means nobody can be sure of its date, but it's probably many hundreds of years old. And currently, a team of international Chinese and British researchers at Jiatong Liverpool University are working hard to crack the script. And they're taking inspiration and methodology from the deciphering of the early ancient Greek script Linear B in the 1950s. Everyone said that task was impossible, but it was inspirationally achieved and illuminated many aspects of Greek late Bronze Age culture. And perhaps the Singapore stone will one day do the same for local history. Now, magnificent civilization flourished in many parts of the world at the same time as those Greek speakers in Crete and mainland Greece were writing down lists of food and wine and sailors and other craftspeople, as well as the names of their gods, in Linear B. Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Egypt, China and Phoenicia are some of the most famous. And the Greeks and Romans were relatively late comers. The period we call classical civilization lasted for approximately 2,000 years. From around 1600 BCE, when those earliest Linear B texts were inscribed, to about 400 CE, when the Roman Empire fully converted to Christianity and the pagan temples and philosophical schools were closed down. But it was between 800 and 300 BCE that people who spoke Greek made a rapid series of intellectual discoveries which propelled the Mediterranean world to a new level of civilization. And this process of self-education was much admired by the Greeks and Romans of the centuries that followed. And then, when the texts and artworks of classical Greece were rediscovered in the European Renaissance, they changed the world for a second time. The phenomenon has been called the Greek miracle, as well as the glory or wonder that was Greece. Many books have been entitled The Greek Genius, The Greek Triumph, The Greek Enlightenment, The Greek Experiment, The Greek Idea, and even The Greek Ideal. But over the last 2 decades, the notion that the Greeks were exceptional has been questioned. It's been stressed that the Greeks were, after all, just one of many ethnic and linguistic groups in the ancient Mediterranean world. Long before the Greeks appeared in the historical record, several complicated, advanced civilizations had arisen. Other peoples provided the Greeks with crucial technological advantages. The Greeks learned the phonetic alphabet from the Phoenicians and how to mint coins from the Lydians. During the period when the Greeks invented rational philosophy and science, after about 600 BCE, their horizons were opened up further by the expansion of the Persian Empire. And so painstaking comparative studies have been published which reveal the Greek miracle to have just been one constituent of a continuous process of intercultural exchange. It's become a new orthodoxy that the Greeks were actually very similar to their ancient Near Eastern neighbours in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Levant, Persia and Asia Minor. Some scholars have gone so far as to ask whether the Greeks came up with anything new at all, or whether they merely acted as a channel or conduit through which the combined wisdom of all the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean was disseminated across the territories conquered by Alexander the Great before arriving at Rome and posterity. Critics of colonialism and racism tend to play down the specialness of the ancient Greeks. Those who still maintain that there was something identifiably different and even superior about the Greeks, on the other hand, are usually conservatives who have a vested interest in proving the superiority of Western ideals and in making evaluative judgments of culture. And my problem is that I fit into neither camp. I'm certainly opposed to colonialism and racism and have investigated reactionary abuses of the classical tradition. But my constant engagement with the ancient Greeks and their culture has made me more rather than less convinced that they evinced a cluster of brilliant qualities which are difficult to identify in combination and in such concentration elsewhere. Now, I don't deny that the Greeks acted as a conduit for other ancient peoples' achievements. But to function successfully as a channel or intermediary is in itself to perform an exceptional role. It requires a range of talents and resources. Taking over someone else's technical knowledge requires an opportunistic ability to identify a serendipitous find or encounter, excellent communicative skills, and the imagination to see how a technique, story, or object could be adapted to a different linguistic and cultural milieu. And in this sense, the Romans fruitfully took over substantial achievements of their civilization from the Greeks, as did the Renaissance humanists. Now, of course, the Greeks weren't by nature or in potential superior to any other human beings, either physically or intellectually. Indeed, they themselves often commented on how difficult it was to distinguish Greek and non-Greek, let alone free person from slave, if all the trappings of culture, clothing and adornment were removed. But that doesn't mean that they weren't the right people in the right place at the right time to take up the human baton of intellectual progress for several hundred years. The ancient Greeks spanned nearly 2,000 years from 1600 BCE to 400 AD, and they lived in thousands of different villages, towns and cities, from Spain to India, the freezing River Don in the northeastern corner of the Black Sea, to remote upland tributaries of the Nile. They were culturally elastic, for they often freely intermarried with other peoples, and by and large they tolerated and even welcomed imported foreign gods. What united them was never geopolitics. With the arguable exception of the short-lived Macedonian Empire in the late 4th century BCE, there was never a recognisable independent state run by Greek speakers and including what we know as Greece, until after the Greek War of Independence in the early 19th century. What the ancient Greeks did have in common was their polysyllabic and flexible language, which still survives today in similar form, despite centuries of serial occupations of Greek-speaking regions by Romans, Ottomans, Venetians and others. And the stamina of this language was by the mid-8th century BCE underpinned by the universal Greek familiarity with certain poems composed in it, especially those of Homer and Hesiod. And the major gods celebrated in these poems, the Olympians, were taken by the ancient Greeks wherever they settled and worshipped, and they worshipped them in sanctuaries with sacrifices. Now, people often ask me what's meant by the term classics. Well, put simply, it's the conventional name given to the study of ancient Greeks and Romans. These days, it's an umbrella term covering all aspects of the field, from art history through philosophy to demography and archaeology. But the label was originally applied to literary texts alone. In English, classic or classical for the Greco-Roman languages and authors was popularised in the 16th century, and in the late 17th century we hear of school teachers specialising in the classics. But it was in the university curricula of 19th century Northern Europe that the field of classics, as we understand it today, took shape and was transported across the world during this age of empires. Greek and Latin had always been read as part of higher education, often in tandem with Hebrew, as the tres linguae, or three languages of Christian scripture and theology. And under the influence of ideas forged in the Enlightenment and Romanticism, however, universities, first in Germany and then across Europe and North America, these universities began to promote classical philology as a distinct discipline, sometimes idealised as a secular route to humanistic values. And from the mid-19th century onwards, new methodologies were developed to deal with new material remains, including inscriptions being found, coins, archaeological sites, and a little later, the ancient papyri unearthed in Egypt. Greece and Rome were arguably the world's best documented and best understood ancient societies. And the classical world is variously defined, following the imperial campaigns of Alexander the Great and the Romans' territorial expansion, that was from the 2nd century BCE onwards. Greco-Roman languages and culture left their marks over huge tracts of Eurasia, even where the empire didn't extend, from Britain in the west to northern India in the east. And the wide distribution of the Greek language in the Eastern Roman Empire and of Latin in the west facilitated the spread of Christianity, which in turn re-embedded the centrality of the languages. More Greek and Latin authors survived than any one individual could read in a lifetime. And the standard database of ancient Greek and Byzantine Greek literature, which is actually incomplete, already contains over 115 million words. Of the ancient Eurasian cultures, only China and India achieved a comparable influence. But in the 21st century, classics is at one level recognisably the same university discipline as it was in the 19th. It's fundamentally a historicist venture, at once aware of the significant shaping influence of Greco-Roman cultures on later ones, particularly in Europe, North Africa and West Asia, and possessed of a strong anthropologically influenced sense of the complexity and otherness of ancient polytheistic societies. But the angle of vision has shifted dramatically over the last 150 years. Democratisation and globalisation have for many shifted the focus away from the elite and explored the perspectives and agency of those excluded from the traditional narrative. Women, outsiders, the poor, slaves, children, animals, even material objects. The conflicts of the 20th century and a slow reckoning with the West's imperial history have foreclosed the casual idealisation of societies premised on slavery, warfare, hierarchies and the subjugation of women. The classical world is increasingly understood in an expansive way in terms of geography, culture, chronology and methodology. Many would see a limitation of their field to speakers of Greek and Latin as restrictive. And since the turn of the 21st century, classicists have explored with a renewed sense of purpose the tangled linguistic and cultural landscapes of ancient North Africa, Anatolia, the Levant, Arabia and Mesopotamia. Others have engaged in comparative studies, particularly in relation to ancient China and India, cultures that experienced at roughly the same times as the Greeks and the Romans analogous phases of rapid urbanisation and economic growth, and also saw a similar embrace of literary, philosophical and artistic ambition. Still others are exploring the post-antique reception of Greco-Roman materials with an increasingly globalised perspective. Growth areas include the study of Arabic reception, of black classicisms, and the percolation of classical themes into mainstream society via much newer media such as video games and comics. So, classics, a discipline founded in the heat of the European Enlightenment, has never been just about the past. As its practitioners have become more politically self-aware, so arguments over its proper role and constitution have intensified, and some would actually reject the label classics altogether on the grounds of its originally exclusionary class-based connotations. But these debates are signs of vitality, urgency and passion. Paradoxically, more people in far more parts of the world now feel connected to and invested in the cultures of ancient Greece and Rome than at any point in the past, perhaps including antiquity itself. It might be unwise to predict the precise shape the discipline will take in the world in the future, but the human need to understand the present in dialogue with the deep past in all its varieties seems with us to stay. But there is one place and period to which all classicists tend to return, because it was so staggeringly fertile culturally and intellectually, and that is democratic Athens in the 5th century BCE. Look at this statue of the Discobolus, or discus thrower, originally cast in bronze by the Athenian sculptor Myron in about 490 BCE. The surviving marble copies show the powerful athlete bending forward in taut concentration, like a spring being coiled to the tightest point. The thrilling Discobolus tightens every muscle to muster maximum physical force, and he's just about to swing his raised arm forward in a great arc and propel the discus spinning through the air. This is raw energy arrested at the split second before discharge. It's the human body at its most powerful, the male nude as muscular machine. And it shows what a pioneering innovator Myron was in his art. He was the first ancient sculptor to invest his statues with a sense of dynamism and weight moving through space. And the effects it is produced by the athlete's revolutionary posture. It's the earliest indisputable Western example of a human figure with his weight unevenly distributed between his two legs, a feature the Italians call contrapposto. Each limb doesn't echo but complements and balances its counterpart on a different plane. And the whole arrangement, like the whole body of the discus thrower in motion, revolves around an absolutely perfect vertical axis. But there's something more. A living man, an athlete, is celebrated here, not a god or hero for whom nudity in sculpture had usually been preserved. The Greek Enlightenment, which was putting humans at the centre of the physical and intellectual universe, here takes an aesthetic form. Myron's skill in releasing a dynamic portrait of human movement from bronze meets the athlete's incomparable skill in his chosen field of excellence. There's not a god in sight. Now, the Roman rhetorician Quintilian recognised that it was the novelty, or novitas, as well as the difficulty of the projects that distinguished this Athenian sculptor from all his predecessors and rivals, and innovation was one of the core constituents of all the Athenians' own self-definition in the classical period, when the full impact of the intellectual enlightenment, which had begun amongst the Eastern Greeks in the 2 centuries before, was absorbed in a democracy. Now, the Athenian democracy wasn't established properly until 507 BCE and was a polity of a novel kind. The Athenians are addicted to innovation, and their plans are characterised by speed, both in their conception and execution. That is the description put into the mouth of a disgruntled Corinthian diplomat worried about Athenian imperial expansionism by the Athenian soldier and historian Thucydides. And another core element in the Athenians' own self-definition was that they welcomed non-Athenians into their city. And according to Thucydides again, the Athenian statesman Pericles praised his fellow citizens thus: "We throw open our city to the world. We never expel a foreigner or prevent him from seeing or learning anything." And even the staunchest critics of Athens were impressed by its cosmopolitan atmosphere. One anti-democratic pamphleteer, by custom called the Old Oligarch, observed that it wasn't the fact of Athenian naval power that made so many different types of luxury available in Athens, whether from Sicily, Cyprus, Egypt, Lydia, or the Black Sea. It was the Athenian instinct to mingle with various peoples. He even says they've made their speech a sort of potpourri of different elements. Hearing every kind of dialect, they've taken something from each. Whereas other Greeks tend to use their own dialect, way of life, and type of dress. But the Athenians use a hybrid mixture from all the Greeks and barbarians. Even though almost all Greeks were seafarers and culturally absorbent, the ancient consensus was thus that the Athenians were the supreme transnational minglers. They encouraged other peoples to learn, in turn, from them. Even the most sacred Athenian mysteries at Eleusis were open to anyone who attended, including slaves, provided that they understood Greek. Now, not only did the Athenian male citizenry, the demos, assume the sovereign executive power, kratos, democracy, in the community, thus producing the most successful and enduring demokratia, democracy of antiquity, it also produced the first great playwrights in world history, as well as the first great writers of philosophy, history, and oratory. Visual artists and architects were no less creative, creating not only sculptures, but vast paintings and temples on which we still feast our eyes today. Countless other beautiful artefacts, paintings, textiles, and items of furniture have sadly not survived the intervening years. A city-state with a population of perhaps 30 or 40,000 free males could produce within 3 generations the tragedian Sophocles, the first important musical theorist Damon, the brilliant statesman Pericles, the tragedian Euripides, the sculptor Phidias, the philosopher Socrates, the historian Thucydides, the comic dramatist Aristophanes, the historian and moralist Xenophon, and the philosopher Plato. And as if these intellectuals weren't enough, Athens welcomed resident foreigners to whom it gave the status of what's called metic, and attracted from overseas such brilliant contributors to its culture as the historian Herodotus, the rhetorician Gorgias, the natural scientist Anaxagoras, the political theorist Protagoras, a mathematician called Theodorus from North Africa, and the orator Lysias, who was actually from Sicily. Now, it's impossible to reconstruct the brilliance and liveliness of the civic culture that these great men shared and enhanced by their contributions. It's hardly surprising that the Theban poet Pindar called Athens the noisy city, a city of ceaseless conversation. And that talk wasn't all in Greek either. In the Archaeological Museum at Athens, there's a brilliant bilingual gravestone with inscriptions in both Greek and Phoenician, dating from the 4th century BC and found in the Kerameikos quarter of Athens, a beautiful part of the city to the northwest of the Acropolis and a thriving commercial district. The dead man's father was named from the Phoenician goddess Astarte, Abdashtat, which was culturally as well as linguistically translated to Aphrodisios after the Greek goddess Aphrodite. And the gravestone has a picture sculpted on it with men fighting a lion and the prow of a ship, which is Phoenician rather than Greek symbolism. But the accompanying inscribed poem, which is in Greek and also explains the picture to Greeks, makes it plain that the original mourners must have constituted a truly bicultural community. Now, in the democracy, all adult male citizens had the right to attend and vote directly on state policy in the assembly, which was the executive body of the city and required a minimum of 6,000 men to be physically present to pass a law. It met about 40 times a year and voted on all major issues: treatment of allies, administration of the empire, declaration of war. And the Assembly also elected magistrates and the 10 annual generals, who in the 5th century had substantial domestic and civic as well as military power. And all members of the Assembly had the right to speak, provided they'd performed 2 years of military service, although in practice the airtime was probably dominated by a small group of elite elder men and professional politicians. It was thought rather inappropriate for young men to talk. Now, it wasn't easy to assemble many thousand talkative Athenians in the venue for the assembly, which was the Pnyx Hill west of the Acropolis. Citizens congregated in the marketplace and moved towards the Pnyx, but required a whole battalion of state slaves to steer them there with ropes and keep order during the proceedings. For example, they removed men who were drunk or brawling, and they evicted speakers who failed to please the people from the platform. Almost every contemporary source emphasises the deafening noise of the assembly. The speakers had to develop massive vocal volume, and they had clacks of supporters and opponents competed to drown out the opposition. It's a very exciting atmosphere. The agenda for the assembly was usually determined by the council, which has been studied rather less than the assembly, but it's actually even more breathtakingly democratic when viewed from the perspective of our own much diluted representative system. The Athenian council was called the boule, which means the place for decision making. It's important in terms of the decisions made by the city is underlined by the speed with which the oligarchs who seized power in 411, very briefly, ousted the democratically elected councillors and took over the building, the bouleuterion, to serve as their own centre of power. The council required no fewer than 500 ordinary citizens to serve, proportionately selected from each of the districts of Attica, that's the Athenian county. They were replaced every year by lot. It could thus have contained a fair cross-section of the citizen body, rich and poor. And since no man could serve more than twice in his life, the chances that any particular citizen would serve at some point in his life, once he'd reached the qualifying age, must have been high, especially after pay was instituted in the later 5th century to encourage poorer citizens to sit on the council. There's some evidence that originally only the top 3 property classes could serve, to the exclusion of the lowest class, the working class men. But that qualification for eligibility was dropped in the later 5th century, or at least not rigidly enforced. And the council met almost every day, and it considered matters relating not only to the state's finances and the scrutiny of magistrates, but Athenian religion, cults, festival, navy, building programme, care for the sick, the disabled and the orphan. There was a big pension system. And to serve as a councillor therefore required accumulating information, assessing past actions and deliberating about future ones virtually all day, every day. And the quality of attention required by the service on the council seems breathtaking when it's compared with what's required of politicians, let alone ordinary citizens today. Now, one really remarkable development under the Athenian democracy was the transformation of the Acropolis under the Periclean building programme. Pericles dominated the Athenian political scene for 30 years, and he consistently supported policies which allowed the Athenians to benefit financially and strategically from its allies, who were sadly increasingly treated as taxable subject states. But Pericles' most enduring achievement is his plan, initiated in 447 BCE, to use some of the wealth the Athenians had acquired from their empire to finance the architectural transformation of the Acropolis, where the city's gods, as well as its treasury, were housed. Now, the Persians, several decades before, had razed the temples of the Acropolis to the ground when they invaded in 480, and until Pericles, they'd never been rebuilt. So in 432 BCE, the great new Parthenon, Temple of Athena, with its Doric columns, friezes and pediment sculptures, had been finally completed. The project had been done under the supervision of Phidias, who also created the massive new gold and ivory statue of Athena the Maiden, Athena Parthenos herself, standing more than 40 foot high, helmeted, breastplated, holding a shield and a statue of Nike, or victory, encrusted with over 1,000 kilos of gold plate. Phidias Athena was one of the most imposing statues the Greeks had ever seen. And the Parthenon frieze, which ran round the whole of the outside surface of the inner building of the temple, most of it now in the British Museum, unfortunately, represents a series of scenes suggestive of a procession in honour of the great goddess inside. Horses, riders, chariots, men with musical instruments, water jars and trays, sacrificial animals, a group of 10 important men, perhaps heroes, seated gods, and a scene involving a male and female official, 3 little children and a folded textile. And the Athenians, the frieze can only have suggested the Pan-Athenite procession, the all-Athens procession for Athena every year. And by the time the Parthenon was completed, visitors also had to pass through the Propylaea, the innovative complex of edifices surrounding the western entrance to the Acropolis, itself accessible only by a long series of wide stone stairs. The main building has 6 Doric columns complementing those of the Parthenon, but also contained an Ionic colonnade from which some of its focal points could be seen at the same time, and that was a new development in architecture at the time. And the wings on either side of the main entrance also featured Doric colonnades. Neither the Erechtheion, another temple built to house the ancient statue of Athena Polias, nor the little temple of Athena Nike to the right of the Acropolis had even yet been built. But in 432, the visitor to the Acropolis will have been able to see all the treasury and the sanctuary of the other virgin goddess felt to be honoured by the Athenians, Artemis. And on the south slope, the sanctuary of Dionysus was the venue for the annual festival of the city Dionysia, which culminated in the drama competitions. So, to return full circle to that self-portrait with ancient Greek statues by Li Manfong, Singaporean creative arts in a cosmopolitan age have found intense inspiration in classical Greek and Roman literature and mythology. If you want to study or indeed create new art in Singapore, then some classical education would be more than supremely useful. So I'll conclude by describing just a few examples. Ancient Greek tragedy is alive and well on the stages of Singapore. Cake Theatre's production Rubber Girl on the Loose in 2019 at the Esplanade Theatre Studio adapted Sophocles' famous tragedy Antigone. This heroine wasn't going to give in or snap under pressure, thus earning the new name Rubber Girl. Ancient Thebes was recast as a hallucinatory modern dystopia under the rule of not one but 3 tyrant creons. The production included heavy metal, Australian and Papuan dancing, and a setting with Singaporean residences. The production by writer-director Natalie Henedich, who's of Sinhalese heritage, are often inspired by ancient classics, following her Electra in 2016 and Medea in 2017. So, while Sophocles' play Antigone is a meditation on the fragility of democracy set in the ancient Greek city-state of Thebes, Henedich's retelling was set in a school and underscores the tragedy of a system that refuses to respond to the needs of its people. Sophocles' tyrant Creon became a headmaster, a chorus of Theban elders became a powerless teacher, an armed sentry became a school prefect who wields drumsticks similar to the percussion instruments Creon used to communicate. Sophocles' play was written to remind Greeks of the danger of staying silent and handing over power to a single person. Rubber Girl on the Loose, said one reviewer, presented a greater tragedy. What happens when civil conflict can't be resolved? Personal beliefs clash with powers above, and what a big bloody mess that can be. In 2017, Henich had taken on Euripides' Medea, perhaps the most challenging Greek tragedy in which a woman kills her own children. She's a refugee and murders them to take revenge on her faithless husband Jason, who's abandoned her for a new wife. And the play unfolded on a white stage crowded with white ziggurat-like mounds. Actors picked their way around them or leapt from block to block like gazelles, sporting white Greek masks or filigreed headgear. And in the background there rose a climbing frame, behind whose bars Medea prowled, and the production conveyed the complexity of her character. One moment she was a bewildered refugee and outcast at whom the word barbarian is casually slung. The next, a femme fatale, coiled in deadly calm. And there was feminist revision in the introduction to the cast of Jason's new wife Creusa, who said, "He comes, he goes, he comes, he goes. Well, I go nowhere." She and Medea are rivals in love, but they're also princesses born alike into the prison of womanhood. So from theatre to fiction, in 2016, Nurulaya Norisid published her first novel, The Gatekeeper. She was born in 1986 as the oldest of 3 children in a family that was extremely poor, but where reading literature was much encouraged. And she fell in love with ancient Greek mythology at an early age. She eventually took a PhD in English literature and creative writing at Nanyang Technological University, where she said she wanted to learn how speculative fiction can be used to explore issues such as marginality, isolation, and socio-historical traumas facing the Malay community in Singapore. And the result was The Gatekeeper, which won the Epigram Books Fiction Prize. The novel's set in Mantikora, a fictional country in a far distant future which has very troubled relationships with its neighbouring nation states. It's run by a human majority who are not keen on the several minority species, most of which are semi-humanids, but they often have scales and were of many shapes, sizes and colours. Now, many of these non-Homo sapiens couldn't survive the human regime and took refuge in a secret society underground called Nalruti. The heroine is called Rhea, and she is a descendant of the ancient Greek Medusa, whose gaze could turn things and men into stone. Now, Medusa was abused as a society as a woman, raped by the sea god and then punished for it by the elite goddess Athena, who turned her hair into snakes. And when Rhea is emotional, the snakes that form her hair start rising in a flurry and hissing. Rhea, under pressure, had turned the whole population of the impressive humans in one village into stone and had to take refuge underground with her sister, Bharani. She remains in hiding for 50 years, since in the upper world she's a wanted criminal, but the other residents of Nalruti fear her as well. She does have a fleeting relationship with a hybrid half-human youth called Edric. Then she, though, seems to descend into rage and madness. The future world she's in has not progressed at all. There's terrible prejudice against people perceived as other, against women, against the lower classes, and racism runs rampant in Mantikora. Underground, the refugees revive ancient religious ritual and burial practices like those of the ancient Greeks. And Rhea shares with Medusa a terrible solitude as an outcast, and Nalruti is partly modelled on classical images of an underworld. Her home is a catacomb filled with strange statues. But the world created in the novel is also recognisably Singapore, even though it's named after a mythical beast, the manticore, or poisonous human-headed lion. And this is brought out in the way that elite humans talk about the poorer inhabitants, saying they don't work hard enough. And Nora Lear wants to lead her readers to confront issues of social, sexual and racial discrimination current in Singaporean society anew. That is through the eyes of the marginalised Medusa and her snaky-haired sisters. My final example is Edwin Nadason Thumbu's famous poem Ulysses by the Merlion, 1979. Thumbu believes that poets of post-independence Singapore should work towards creating a national literature and art that addresses the public sphere. And his works often use classical mythology to lend them a universal and international human scope that connects Singapore with world history and culture. I don't think it's an accident that he chose Ulysses, the Latin version of the name of Odysseus, ever since James Joyce chose the Odyssey to structure his novel Ulysses, published the same year that the Irish Republic achieved independence in 1922. Localised versions of the Odyssey have become a favoured way worldwide of establishing national literatures. And Thumbu's poem refers to the iconic statue of a beast with the upper body of a lion and the tail of a fish called the Merlion that faces Marina Bay. And I visited it and photographed it on a brief visit to Singapore about 10 years ago. Thumbu has said he was inspired by the use of Irish mythology and history by the Irish poet W.B. Yeats, as he recognises parallels between Ireland's nationalistic struggle and Singapore's breakaway from colonialism. Ancient mythology has thus long ceased to belong to the world. It's a world heritage for the human race everywhere to share multiculturally. And many other Singaporean poets have followed Thumbu's example, including Felix Cheong and Darren Shao. A copy of the poem is installed on a plaque near the statue. And Thumbu's thoughts about history could be a manifesto for classical education in Singapore. Classics may have been introduced as a colonial curriculum, but the understanding of Singaporean cultural identity cannot be fully achieved without an appreciation of ancient Greek and Roman mythology and art. His poem mingles Hindu gods and Chinese symbols, as well as the Merlion and etymology of Singapura, Lion City, with the ancient Greek mythology. And he said, "History enters my writing as it ought to enter the writing of others because of its importance in our lives." I go back to this point about the historical moments we occupy. As a former colony and a multiracial one created by the British, we need history for a sense of things, to reinscribe ourselves, discover and in certain areas define ourselves as individuals, as groups in a multiracial society. They give you a sense of their belonging, which also happens to be mine. They give you an inherited cultural identity that you put together by being conscious of what you've absorbed or taken in. I live in Singapore. I have likes and dislikes, a set of interests, a set of values, a set of responsibilities. History I see as fully inclusive, fully in terms of one's personal limits, and it includes beliefs and anything of significance. Nothing is irrelevant. So I close with Thumbu's poem, Ulysses by the Merlion. I have sailed many waters, skirted islands of fire, contended with Circe, who loved the squeal of pigs, past Scylla and Charybdis to 7 years with Calypso. I've heaved in battle against the gods. Beneath it all, I kept faith with Ithaca, travelled and travelled, suffering much, enjoying little. Met strange people singing new myths, made myths myself. But this lion of the sea, salt-maned, scaly, wondrous of tail, touched with power, insistent on this brief promontory, puzzles. Nothing in my days foreshadowed this half beast, half fish, this powerful creature of land and sea. People settled here, brought to this island the bounty of these seas, built towers topless as Iliums. They make, they serve, they buy, and they sell. Despite unequal ways, together they mutate and explore the edges of harmony, search for a centre, have changed their gods, kept some memory of their race in prayer, laughter, the way their women dress and greet. They hold the bright, the beautiful, good ancestral dreams within new visions, so shining, urgent, full of what is now. Perhaps, having dealt in things, surfeited on them, their spirits yearn again for images, adding to the dragon, phoenix, Garuda, Naga, those horses of the sun, this lion of the sea, this image of themselves. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm Edith Hall, Professor of Classics at the University of Durham, and I particularly thank Lauren Maguire-Wilkie, for whom I taught to her girls and boys long ago in Bourton-on-the-Water, for inviting me to partake in this delightful festival. Thank you and goodbye.